The laughter in the upscale garage echoed off the pristine epoxy floors as the young mechanics pointed at the rusted heap of metal. They thought the old man was delusional. They thought his vehicle was junk, but they had no idea what was hiding under the hood of that rusted Jeep. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on the asphalt of West End Boulevard, baking the pavement until the air shimmered with heat waves. Arthur Hayes sat behind the cracked steering wheel of his 1952 Willys M38 Jeep, the heavy canvas top rolled back, exposing his weathered face to the stifling air. At 72, Arthur looked every bit like a man who had weathered storms. Deep lines etched his face, mapping out decades of quiet resilience, and his hands, scarred and calloused, rested lightly on the worn gearshift. To anyone else on the road, the vehicle he drove was an eyesore, a metallic ghost that had outlived its era by half a century. The olive-drab paint had long since surrendered to the elements, peeling away in jagged flakes to reveal a dark, aggressive rust that ate around the wheel wells and the edges of the hood. The passenger seat was held together by strips of faded black duct tape, and the front bumper sat slightly askew, bearing the dent of an old forgotten impact. It looked like something dragged from the bottom of a murky lake, sputtering along on borrowed time. Arthur turned the heavy, unassisted steering wheel, guiding the Jeep into the pristine, palm-lined driveway of Apex Auto Tuning. Apex was not a standard neighborhood garage. It was a high-end European and exotic tuning facility in the wealthy suburb of Oak Haven, California. Through the massive glass bay doors gleamed the polished chassis of imported supercars, Porsches, McLarens, and late-model BMWs. The floor inside was coated in a flawless white epoxy, so clean a surgeon could have operated on it. And Arthur knew a thing or two about surgeons. 45 years ago, Arthur had been a combat medic in the sweltering, blood-soaked jungles of Vietnam. He had spent his youth in emergency triage tents, his hands slick with mud and iodine fighting desperately to keep young men breathing while mortar fire shook the earth beneath his boots. The trauma of those days had followed him home, a heavy shadow that clung to his waking hours. When he returned, he had found his therapy not in talking, but in turning wrenches. He had bought the derelict Willys Jeep from an army surplus auction and spent 3 decades rebuilding it. But Arthur had made a very specific, deeply personal choice. He never touched the exterior. He left the rust, the dents, the peeling paint. To him, the scarred metal represented the men he had served with, battered, bruised, and carrying the ugly marks of war on the outside. But the inside, the engine, the transmission, the chassis, that was where Arthur had poured his soul, treating the mechanics of the vehicle like the intricate cardiovascular system of a patient. He had rebuilt the heart of the machine to absolute terrifying perfection. As the rusted Jeep rolled over the threshold of the open garage door, the immediate contrast was jarring. The quiet hum of a diagnostic machine was interrupted by the heavy, rhythmic crunch of Arthur's oversized, mud-caked tires on the spotless floor. Inside the bay, 3 mechanics stopped dead in their tracks. The shop owner, Trent Harding, a man in his late 30s wearing a spotless branded polo shirt and an expensive watch, lowered his clipboard. Beside him stood Cody Reynolds, the 20-something lead technician whose hair was perfectly styled and who wore a pair of designer safety glasses resting on his forehead. The third mechanic, a younger apprentice named Brett, simply let his jaw drop. Arthur brought the Jeep to a halt, the brakes emitting a sharp metallic squeak that seemed to echo offensively in the cavernous high-tech space. He pulled the heavy emergency brake lever, unfastened his lap belt, and stepped out onto the pristine floor, his worn leather boots planting firmly. "Can I help you, pal?" Trent asked, his voice dripping with immediate, thinly veiled condescension. He didn't step forward to greet Arthur. Instead, He crossed his arms, looking at the jeep as if it were a stray dog that had just wandered in to track mud on his carpet. "I need a specialized laser alignment," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded an easy authority. "And a calibration on the rear suspension geometry. I noticed you have the new Hunter Hawkeye Elite rack. Standard racks can't handle my track width." Cody let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as he walked in a slow circle around the rusted front end of the Willys. He reached out and tapped the heavily oxidized hood with his knuckles. The metal gave a dull, hollow thud. "Track width," Cody scoffed, looking back at Trent with a wide grin. "Grandpa, the only thing this rust bucket needs is a tow truck to the nearest scrap yard. You sure you didn't take a wrong turn? There's a pick-and-pull dump about 3 miles down the highway." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He had faced down ranking officers under heavy artillery fire. The mockery of a mechanic with a manicured beard barely registered on his pulse. "The chassis requires the Hawkeye system," Arthur repeated calmly, pulling a folded, grease-stained piece of paper from his flannel shirt pocket. "I have the exact camber and caster specifications written down. I'll pay your premium hourly rate. I just need it on the rack." Trent stepped forward, his expression hardening into a look of outright dismissal. "Look, mister, whatever your name is." "Arthur." "Look, Arthur, we deal in high-performance tuning here. We don't do salvage yard restorations, and we definitely don't put rolling tetanus hazards on our $50,000 alignment racks. Half that suspension is probably going to disintegrate the second we put a wrench to the tie rods. I'm not having your junk snap and damage my equipment." "Nothing is going to disintegrate," Arthur replied, his blue eyes locking onto Trent's with an unnerving, icy calm. "The suspension is entirely sound." "Sound?" Cody laughed loudly, drawing the attention of a wealthy customer in a tailored suit who was waiting in the glass-walled lounge area. The customer peered over his magazine, watching the spectacle with a smirk. Cody pointed dramatically at the front left wheel well, which was coated in decades of dried, baked-on grime. "Buddy, I can see the rust eating through the leaf springs from here. I wouldn't trust this thing to make it over a speed bump, let alone drive at highway speeds. What's powering this thing anyway? A lawnmower engine on its last legs." Arthur slowly looked away from Trent and focused his gaze on the young, arrogant technician. He remembered the arrogant young doctors who used to fly into the triage units, fresh out of medical school, thinking they knew everything about trauma, until the reality of a ruptured artery sprayed across their crisp scrubs. Cody had the exact same look in his eyes, the blind arrogance of a man who had never looked beneath the surface of a wound. "The engine is fine," Arthur said softly. "Fine, yeah. I bet it purrs like a dying walrus." Cody sneered, turning to the other mechanics, who were now chuckling openly. "Tell you what, Artie, I'll give you 500 cash right now. Just leave the keys in the ignition, and I'll have the scrap guys come haul it away. It'll save you the embarrassment of having it break down in the middle of an intersection." The tension in the garage had shifted from mild annoyance to outright theatrical mockery. Trent Harding, sensing that his wealthy customer in the lounge was enjoying the show, decided to lean into the joke. He walked over to the passenger side of the Jeep, dramatically running a finger along the edge of the rusted windshield frame before pretending to wipe grime off on his pants. "Cody's being generous, Arthur." Trent said, a smug smile playing on his lips. "I wouldn't give you 200 for the metal. Honestly, it's a safety hazard just sitting here. If the EPA walked in right now, they'd probably fine us just for letting it leak whatever toxic sludge is dripping out of that oil pan." Arthur stood his ground, his posture perfectly straight. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He slowly folded the piece of paper containing his suspension specs and slid it back into his breast pocket. "There are no leaks," Arthur stated, his voice carrying clearly through the large, echoing space. "The seals are military-grade double-seated. The fluids are immaculate. I assure you, my money spends just as well as the man in the waiting room. Are you refusing my business?" "We're refusing the liability," Cody interjected, stepping right up to Arthur's personal space. The young mechanic crossed his arms, looking down slightly at the older veteran. "Because to put it on the rack, we have to drive it onto the ramp. And to drive it onto the ramp, we have to start it. And I'm willing to bet my entire week's paycheck that if you turn that key, either nothing happens, or the block cracks in half and sprays rusty coolant all over my clean floor." The apprentice, Brett, snickered loudly from the toolboxes. Arthur looked at Cody, taking the measure of the young man. "You're a gambling man, son," Cody smirked. "When the odds are this obvious, absolutely. Tell you what, you turn the key right now. If that thing starts on the first crank, and it can actually pull its own weight onto the alignment rack without stalling or vibrating apart, I'll do the alignment myself, completely free of charge. But when it just clicks and dies, you push it out of our bay and never come back." Trent chuckled, stepping back and gesturing grandly toward the driver's seat. "You heard the man, Arthur. Let's hear the mighty roar of the junkyard beast." Arthur didn't say a word. The silence stretched for a long, heavy moment. He slowly turned away from the mocking faces of the mechanics and walked back toward the driver's side of the Jeep. He reached out and grabbed the rusted frame of the doorless entryway, pulling himself up into the cracked leather seat. He didn't rush. He moved with the methodical, deliberate precision of a man who understood that true power never needs to announce itself prematurely. The mechanics gathered around the front of the vehicle, a semicircle of skeptics waiting for the punchline of a joke. Cody even pulled out his smartphone, casually tapping the screen to open his camera. "Hold on, I gotta get this on video for the shop's Instagram. How to start a fossil." "Ready when you are, Grandpa." Sitting in the driver's seat, Arthur's hands moved through a rapid, entirely unexpected sequence. He didn't just reach for the key. He reached beneath the rusted dashboard, his fingers finding a hidden row of heavy-duty aircraft-grade toggle switches mounted completely out of sight. Click, click, click. First, the dual high-pressure fuel pumps primed. A faint, almost imperceptible electronic whine echoed from beneath the rear chassis, entirely masked by the noise of the shop's air compressor in the background. Second, the secondary cooling fans engaged. Third, the ignition circuit went live. Arthur then reached down to the floorboard, pressing his heavy boot against the heavy-duty racing clutch. It required an immense amount of leg strength, far more than any standard classic car. "Any day now?" Trent called out, checking his watch with an exaggerated sigh. "Don't flood it." Arthur finally slipped the heavy brass key into the ignition cylinder. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. In that brief darkness, he wasn't in a sterile garage in California. He was back in the medical tent, the chaotic screaming fading away as his hands plunged into a chest cavity, finding the beating heart of a dying soldier, gripping it and forcing it to pump. He had saved that boy. He had brought him back from the absolute brink. He opened his eyes. He grasped the key, and he turned it. There was no sluggish grinding of an old starter motor. There was no pathetic click of a dead battery, and there was certainly no sputtered cough of a dying engine. Instead, the starter engaged with the sharp, violent snap of a heavy-caliber rifle firing. Crack boom. The sound that erupted from beneath the rusted hood was apocalyptic. It was a massive, concussive shockwave of sound that physically hit the mechanics in the chest. Cody dropped his phone. It clattered loudly onto the epoxy floor, but the sound was completely swallowed by the monstrous, deafening roar of a heavily modified, twin-turbocharged, 7.0-liter LSX V8 engine springing to life. It wasn't just loud, it was the terrifying, rhythmic, aggressive lope of a high-lift racing cam, an engine tuned to the absolute razor's edge of mechanical capability. The entire rusted chassis of the Willys violently twisted to the right from the sheer raw torque of the motor, turning over the heavy suspension, compressing as the engine breathed. Wub, 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 wub. The idle was a deep, guttural, earth-shaking growl, the exhaust note venting through custom-fabricated ceramic-coated headers hidden deep within the rusted frame, bypassed standard mufflers and expelled a blast of clean, fiercely hot air that ruffled Cody's perfectly styled hair from 10 feet away. Inside the garage, utter pandemonium took hold. The high-frequency vibrations of the engine literally caused the expensive metal wrenches hanging on Trent's pegboard to rattle violently against the wall. The wealthy customer in the lounge dropped his magazine, spilling a paper cup of espresso down his tailored slacks as he jumped up from his chair, his eyes wide in disbelief. Arthur sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, his foot hovering over the accelerator pedal. His face remained a mask of stoic calm, completely unaffected by the mechanical hurricane raging beneath his boots. He glanced over at Cody. The young lead technician was frozen in place, his mouth hanging open in a silent O of shock. The smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression of genuine, unadulterated awe. Trent, the shop owner, was physically backing away, his hands raised slightly, as if the vehicle were a wild animal that had just snapped its cage wide open. Arthur lightly blipped the throttle. Just a fraction of an inch. Vroom, crack. The engine responded with a ferocious, snapping bark that echoed off the high ceiling like a thunderclap, the twin turbochargers emitting a sharp, lethal whistle as they spooled up instantly. The sheer volume was staggering, a symphony of perfectly synchronized, hyper-engineered violence, hiding beneath a shell of rusted decay. Arthur looked out the open door frame at the 3 stunned men. The laughter was gone. The arrogance had been instantly vaporized by 800 horsepower of undeniable roaring reality. Arthur leaned slightly out of the cab, raising his voice, just enough to be heard over the monstrous idle of the engine. Now, the old veteran said, his eyes locking dead onto Cody's pale face. Are you going to open the bay doors to the alignment rack, or do I need to find a mechanic who actually knows what they're looking at? The heavy, suffocating silence in the upscale garage was broken only by the aggressive, rhythmic thumping of the Willys Jeep's monstrous engine. Cody Reynolds stood entirely frozen, the blood completely drained from his face. The mocking, arrogant smirk he had worn just moments before had been obliterated, replaced by a wide-eyed stare of pure, unadulterated mechanical reverence. He swallowed hard his Adam's apple, bobbing nervously, and slowly looked from the rusted peeling hood to Arthur Hayes's stoic, unmoving expression. Cody stammered, his voice cracking noticeably over the deep, vibrating rumble of the exhaust. I'll get the bay doors open right now, sir. Trent Harding, the wealthy shop owner who had just threatened to throw Arthur out onto the street, practically tripped over his own expensive leather shoes as he scrambled toward the wall console. He desperately hammered the button for the heavy glass bay doors. As the massive panes of glass rolled upward with a mechanical hum, Arthur eased the heavy racing clutch out. The Jeep lurched forward with the constrained, terrifying energy of a chained predator. It didn't squeak. It didn't rattle. It moved with an absolute, terrifying solidity that defied every expectation its exterior suggested. As Arthur guided the vehicle onto the $50,000 Hunter Hawkeye Elite Alignment rack, the true extent of the old veteran's deception became undeniably clear to the stunned mechanics. Once the vehicle was elevated safely 6 feet into the air, illuminated brilliantly by the bright LED shop lights from beneath, the illusion of the rusted, neglected junkyard relic completely vanished. Trent Cody and the young apprentice Brett walked slowly under the hydraulic lift. What they saw made them completely speechless. Beneath the meticulously preserved, heavily oxidized exterior shell lay a custom-fabricated, chromally tubular chassis, TIG-welded with the kind of flawless precision usually reserved for advanced aerospace engineering. The rusted floor pans hid a completely flat carbon fiber belly pan designed specifically for high-speed aerodynamics. The suspension wasn't the broken hazardous leaf springs Cody had loudly laughed at. It was an intricate, fully adjustable inboard pushrod suspension system featuring billet aluminum control arms, custom coilovers, and brilliant titanium hardware. "My God," Trent whispered breathlessly, reaching up to trace a trembling finger along the pristine, braided, stainless steel brake lines that snaked elegantly along the frame. "This isn't a salvage restoration. This is a bespoke million-dollar hypercar hiding inside a junk suit." Cody was staring wide-eyed at the differential, a massive, custom-machined 9-inch rear end built explicitly to handle 4-digit horsepower figures without shattering. "Arthur, who built this? What underground shop did this kind of work?" Arthur slowly climbed down the metal stairs from the alignment rack, his heavy boots echoing loudly in the now quiet shop. He had killed the ignition, but the intense heat radiating from the twin turbochargers still warmed the cool, air-conditioned air of the bay. "I did," Arthur replied, simply pulling a clean red shop rag from his back pocket and wiping his calloused hands. Every single bolt, every weld, every fluid line. The mechanic stared at him in disbelief, desperately trying to reconcile the image of the 72-year-old veteran in a faded flannel shirt with the absolute masterclass of automotive engineering suspended securely above their heads. "But why?" Brett, the young apprentice, blurted out, completely unable to contain his burning curiosity. "Why make it look exactly like this? You could have painted it perfectly. You could have made it an award-winning show car. It looks like it belongs abandoned in a scrap heap." Arthur stopped wiping his hands. His blue eyes darkened slightly, a profound shadow passing over his weathered features, as he looked up at the scarred, olive-drab metal of the undercarriage. This vehicle wasn't just a car to him. It was a deeply personal memorial, a steel monument to a history written in blood, profound loss, and unexpected miracles in 1972. Arthur began his voice, dropping into a quiet, commanding tone that demanded absolute, unwavering attention from everyone in the room. "I was serving as a senior triage medic at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. We received a desperate emergency helicopter transfer one night. The patient was a young combat engineer named David Bradley. He had suffered massive, catastrophic thoracic trauma. The lead surgeons took one look at the scans and gave him less than a 10% chance of surviving the night." The names and the grim reality hung heavily in the sterile air of the luxury garage, instantly grounding the incredible machine in a harsh, sobering reality. "I refused to accept that." Arthur continued, his voice steady but thick with memory. "I spent 48 hours straight in that high-stakes intensive care unit. I managed his chest tubes, monitored his crashing vitals, and ran emergency blood transfusions by hand when the main surgical theaters overflowed with new casualties. We fought for every single heartbeat." Arthur walked slowly over to the front driver's side wheel well. He pointed directly to a deep, jagged gouge in the rusted metal, the exact same mark that Cody had arrogantly mocked earlier. "David survived against all odds," Arthur said softly, his fingers brushing the rusted metal. "We became closer than brothers. Before the war, he was a brilliant, eccentric automotive engineer, quietly working on classified aerospace composites and extreme high-performance engines. When he passed away 5 years ago from an aggressive illness, His final will revealed a stunning surprise. He had left a massive secret inheritance solely for me. It wasn't cash. It was a deed to an undocumented hidden underground bunker out in the remote Nevada desert. The mechanics listened in absolute, stunned silence, hanging on to every single word. I drove out there. Arthur recalled a faint smile touching his lips. Inside that dark bunker were heavy wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. They were filled with prototype, million-dollar hypercar components he had spent his entire life designing and hiding away from corporate vultures. He left me his life's ultimate work, perfectly preserved in the dark. Arthur turned his piercing gaze back to the three men. I bought this exact Willys Jeep at a surplus auction. I didn't want to erase its scars. The rust, the deep dents, the peeling paint, that is the history. That is exactly what we went through in the triage tents. Erasing that exterior would be a terrible betrayal of the broken men I treated. But underneath, the heart, I used David's hidden inheritance to make the heart entirely unbreakable. Just like the boys I served alongside. Battered relentlessly on the outside, but possessing an engine of absolute, undeniable roaring power on the inside. The wealthy customer in the suit, Richard Belmont, had walked over from the waiting lounge during the captivating story. He stood silently, near the heavy hydraulic lift, staring up at the old veteran with an expression of profound, unshakable respect. The earlier mockery, the smug laughter, the arrogant bets, every ounce of it had been completely atomized by the immense weight of the reality Arthur shared. Arthur. Richard spoke up, his voice incredibly steady but deeply respectful. I heavily collect cars. I own a private warehouse full of pristine Ferraris, vintage Aston Martins, and custom builds. I have never in my entire life seen a machine with a genuine soul like this one. I will write you a certified check right now for $500,000. You can just leave the keys on the workbench. Trent and Cody audibly gasped. $500,000 for a vehicle that looked like it legitimately belonged inside an industrial metal crusher. Arthur did not even glance at the expensive leather checkbook Richard was slowly pulling from his tailored jacket pocket. He simply smiled. A very small, knowing, and distinctly sad smile. Mr. Belmont, Arthur said politely, his tone polite but incredibly firm. You cannot simply buy ghosts, and you certainly cannot buy my most sacred memories. This vehicle is absolutely not for sale. It will never be for sale. Richard nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation completely. I figured as much, sir. But I absolutely had to ask. It is an unparalleled, breathtaking masterpiece. Arthur gracefully turned his attention back to Cody. The young lead mechanic was still standing nervously near the computerized alignment console, looking at Arthur with a heavy mixture of deep guilt and overwhelming admiration. Well, son, Arthur said, his tone significantly lighter, now beautifully stripped of the earlier heavy tension. We made a very public bet. The vehicle started on the first crank. It drove itself smoothly onto the ramp. Does that free laser alignment still stand, or do I need to find my wallet? Cody practically jumped to attention. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Completely on the house. I will personally calibrate the system to your exact, rigorous specifications. It would be an absolute honor to work on this magnificent vehicle, Mr. Hayes. For the next 2 meticulously detailed hours, the luxury European auto shop transformed completely into a quiet sanctuary, explicitly dedicated to the rusted Willys. Cody and Trent worked tirelessly, treating the incredibly complex custom suspension components with the gentle, awestruck reverence of museum restorers handling a priceless historical artifact. Arthur stood quietly by, occasionally offering a specific torque specification or a brief, fascinating explanation of the custom geometry he had brilliantly designed to handle the massive horsepower on standard street tires. There was absolutely no more condescension in the air. There were no more foolish jokes about scrap yards or tetanus shots. Every single time Cody reached up to adjust a solid aluminum tie rod, he caught a quick glimpse of the rusted exterior shell and vividly remembered the gripping story of the medical triage unit and the hidden desert bunker. The mechanics were receiving a profound education, not just in advanced cutting-edge automotive engineering, but in deep humility, unwavering respect, and the incredible hidden depths of the ordinary people they blindly passed on the street every single day. When the alignment was finally verified as absolutely perfect, Arthur climbed back into the worn driver's seat. He did not engage the violent starter with the same aggressive theatrics as before. He simply flipped the hidden aircraft toggles, pressed the heavy racing clutch to the floor, and let the massive engine roar to life with a steady, deep, beautifully vibrating idle. Cody guided him carefully back off the metal ramp, his hand gestures incredibly precise and deeply respectful. As Arthur brought the heavy jeep to a gentle stop near the open glass bay doors, the young mechanic jogged respectfully up to the driver's side window area. "Mr. Hayes." Cody said, his voice incredibly earnest, his previously immaculate manicured appearance completely forgotten as he wiped a dark smudge of heavy grease from his cheek. "I want to sincerely apologize. For earlier, I unfairly judged a book entirely by its cover, and I was completely out of line. I was foolishly arrogant, and I was entirely wrong." Arthur looked calmly down at the young man. He slowly extended his deeply scarred, calloused right hand. "Apology accepted, Cody," Arthur stated clearly. "Just remember one crucial thing for me. The brightest paint jobs often hide the weakest engines, and the deepest scars usually protect the strongest hearts." Arthur released his grip, shifted into first gear, and drove out. They watched in complete and absolute silent respect as the old veteran disappeared forever. Did this incredible story of a rusted Jeep and an old veteran's hidden truth leave you absolutely speechless? Never judge a book by its cover, because the deepest scars often hide the absolute strongest hearts. If Arthur's unforgettable journey inspired you today, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking, real-life, thrilling, dramatic stories. Drop a quick comment below and tell us what you thought of this massive twist. The high